Hello, I'm Hannah Kaplan, and this is the WCS Wild Audio Podcast, where you'll find reported audio stories covering the latest news and newsmakers from the Wildlife Conservation Society's Global Conservation Program, Zoos and Aquarium, and their many partners. We've got a great show today, so let's get to it.
The 16th Conference of the Parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity kicks off on October 21st in Cali, Colombia. The United States is one of only 2 UN member states that is actually not a party to the CBD Treaty, but it's expected to have a significant presence at COP16. WCS Wild Audio's Dan Rosen has more.
The Convention on Biological Diversity is an international treaty that's been around since the 1990s. It provides commitments and guidance on the conservation of biodiversity around the world. Every 2 years, the parties to the treaty meet at a major event called the Conference of the Parties. Back in the 1990s, the U.S. Senate failed to ratify the CBD Treaty. There were concerns about intellectual property rights and the redistribution of U.S. wealth overseas. But today, the U.S. still plays a big part.
The U.S. is a major player at the Conference of Parties and has been successful at driving ambition in policy action and nature finance pledges.
Kelly Aylward is WCS's Executive Director of Federal Affairs and Policy. She says the U.S. government today is acutely aware that the loss of nature is a destabilizing force around the world.
Whether it's conflicts over scarce water or farmable land that drive human migration, severe weather events, or the spillover of pathogens from animals to people, the biodiversity crisis is a threat multiplier that demands global action.
That's why the U.S. government, Kelly says, has taken strides alongside the rest of the world to halt and reverse nature loss by 2030. In its first term, the Biden-Harris administration has advanced several domestic policies to address the biodiversity crisis.
The U.S. government is one of the top 5 global biodiversity and nature positive program financiers. Most recently, the U.S. pledged $600 million to the Global Environment Facility Trust Fund under its 8th replenishment process. The GEF is the financial instrument of the Convention on Biological Diversity, the Convention on Desertification, and a handful of other international agreements. The U.S. Agency for International Development has a sustainable development program dedicated to biodiversity conservation. It's funded at $385 million per year and supports conservation of large terrestrial and marine areas, countering nature crimes, building resilience through nature-based solutions, and addressing the spillover of zoonotic pathogens that cause pandemics like COVID-19.
Even though the U.S. isn't a party to the Global Biodiversity Framework that CBD members adopted in 2022, it has taken steps that demonstrate a commitment to 30 by 30, or protecting 30% of land and sea by 2030.
So, for example, it launched the America the Beautiful initiative, designating significant amounts of land and water for conservation. It conducted a domestic forest inventory. It called for a national nature assessment. And it has nearly finalized a biodiversity plan, and that needs to be released before the end of the current administration, if possible. All these actions are consistent with being a party to CBD, even though they're an observer, and they also serve as models for other countries to advance similar nature-positive policies and actions.
There are other U.S. actions in the works, Kelly says, that would go a long way to advancing 30 by 30. The U.S. Foundation for International Conservation Act, or U.S. FICA, is nearing passage in Congress. It would establish a foundation for international conservation and leverage public and private investments to provide sustainable financing for protected areas and indigenous reserves over the long term.
The independent foundation stood up by this bill would be overseen by a small board with representatives from the U.S. federal agencies engaged in international conservation, would also include private sector donors and conservation experts, all sitting on the board to oversee future projects and avoid duplication with existing U.S. government efforts and investments. And the foundation would contribute an additional $100 million per year to global conservation efforts.
Another action Kelly would like to see is the designation of the Hudson Canyon off the U.S.'s East Coast as a national marine sanctuary.
The deep sea canyon is as deep as the Grand Canyon and is home to critical cold water corals that strengthen the ecological integrity of this feeding ground for migrating whales, sharks, turtles, and seabirds. We would love to see a proposed final rule for the Hudson Canyon before the next administration.
Ultimately, Kelly is optimistic the U.S. will continue to drive the ambition and actions of other governments and civil society to conserve the world's remaining biodiversity. For WCS Wild Audio, I'm Dan Rosen.
Today's episode was produced and reported by Dan Rosen, with help from Hannah Kaplan and Nat Moss. The WCS Wild Audio Podcast is a production of the Wildlife Conservation Society. Please join us next week for a new episode, and don't forget to rate or review the show wherever you get your podcasts.